have a cold myself and normally would have talked to you via Skype, but wanted to come in person because some of you were concerned about the exam and I wanted to be able to discuss that in person. Sophie may have mentioned, or probably most of you, take a look if you haven't, look at the email I sent out an hour or two ago. Have all of you seen that? Did you mention that earlier before I came in? Yeah, okay, great. So basically, congratulations on the exam. Everyone who took the exam did a good job. Nobody really did a poor job. And so the grading is compressed, and everyone who took the exam is in range to do an A for the course. So it's a question, if you don't have an A in the midterm, you can still have an A for the course by doing a little bit more work, and that's what we're talking about with some specifics there. Basically, postings on on Canvas, and then pasting those together in one Word document just for grade reviewing at the end. Any questions on any of that you'd like to raise at this point? Yes.
Are the grades up on Canvas?
Are the grades?
Are they posted on Canvas?
No. Did you not get it?
Yeah, they were emailed to you as individuals. Each individual person who took the exam should have gotten their grade.
Then you should have gotten yours. So if you did not get an exam back and you took it, there's a problem. Let me know.
Okay. So maybe it worked for everyone but one. Apologies. Let's see. We got a couple of things we can do today. First is to check if there are other people who may have some paper ideas they want to run by us as we did the last couple of sessions. Okay. If we have no candidates, I can talk about the last sections of the course. First preference to paper ideas. Okay. And feel free to raise your hand if something comes up. All right. I'm mainly going to talk about the last section called Economic Development Impacts, although we can flip back to earlier sessions as appropriate. We've been talking about economic development impacts ever since the first section of the course, in the sense that we put everything together in a path diagram where we have the community characteristics over here, we have leadership and organized groups, civic activities, political parties, and then we look at how these things join in policy outputs over here. So we've been talking about how important is this or this or this or this in affecting policy outputs, and so now we're just sort of recapping in slightly different ways. One is to contrast approaches which have been used by others in the field, and we got a couple of things on the reading list as background for this. The widely used still book by Logan and Molich called Urban Fortunes came out initially in 1987. They're two sociologists. At the time, they were leaning toward Marxism pretty heavily. They had not so much before, and they basically afterward have given up a lot of the sort of stronger class deterministic kind of language. But in this book, they stress developers, urban developers, banks, finance, as key drivers in shifting mayors and city council members' preferences and leading to an economically oriented model of how it works. There's no chapter on mayors. There's no chapter on political leaders. There are no chapters on this at all. It's really private banks and development entrepreneurs who they suggest are the key drivers of urban fortunes. And with the title, their book implies their focus is on the money in cities. So the money is the cause, the money is the policy output that they're interested in. However, it builds on a paper that Malich did called "The City as a Growth Machine." And the basic idea was that cities are there to grow money for investors. And if you have a house, you can grow the value of your house as well. But that sees the house more in terms of its market value. They then introduced the Marxian contrast between use value and exchange value, and say that use value tends to get played down by the market, but it's not something which they try to elaborate in any coherent way. They simply say it's a problem in a sense. Okay, that's a 3-minute simple summary of the core of the original book. Second, 20 years later, let's say over the 20 years after the book came out 87, 97, 2007, 2017, so it's 30 years. After about during the first 20 years, they basically changed their minds. John Logan very explicitly published 2 papers where he basically said we were wrong. Business and developers do not drive development. And he did this in 2 ways. One was a review of 20 years of case studies of individual cities, for the most part, everything he could find that dealt with these kinds of issues, urban development and so forth, and published that, saying basically the majority of them do, that is, and let me qualify with, because I've addressed this in various ways too. Bankers, business-related civic groups, chambers of commerce are important in U.S. cities, and often to slightly less degree, but still they can be quite important in cities in Western Europe and other countries of the world. However, their policies, what they want, is not clear. That is, so we have many studies where people ask, how important are the following groups? But the fact that you know that the business leaders of Lake Tahoe, California, are important, and so are the business leaders of Waco, Texas, does not imply that the business leaders in Waco want the same policies as the business leaders of Lake Tahoe. And if, in fact, when there have been studies done of this, the Lake Tahoe business leaders are pretty close to the citizens of Lake Tahoe, in that everybody enjoys, celebrates, and wants to guard carefully the natural beauties of the lake, the mountains, the surrounding areas, and the like. So they have carefully controlled policies not to build too much in those areas, which might hurt the views, hurt the access patterns, and so forth. Whereas in other places, like Lawrence, Kansas, we talked about in the case study of Schumacher. Paul Schumacher is the opposite. That is, the citizens of Lawrence want more development. Okay. 30 years ago. If you look at the new introduction to the book by Logan and Malich, as it was republished, they have a long new introduction, and it talks about these kinds of things, such as my Lake Tahoe example, that kind of thing, in terms that are very similar to what you've seen in later literature and in the first sections of this course. Wow. That is, I'm saying, they're saying very similar things. So are, many of the other readings at the beginning of the course, which say the old models don't work so well. Harvey Molich has done a couple of books. One is called something like Making Things. And basically, 1 and 2, he did a very powerful paper in the American Sociological Review contrasting Ventura, California, and Santa Barbara, 2 adjacent cities, and they each followed diametrically different economic development policies. Ventura said, pump oil all that you can, and don't worry about people. Santa Barbara did the opposite. Stop oil, nothing near the beach. We want this to be a beautiful area. They attracted the University of California to build a new campus in the early 20th century. That in turn was leveraged to make it into a very attractive area. So they had very different styles. And Molich doesn't use quite the same terms, but basically the local political cultures redefined urban development policies. And that's basically the argument that you get in many of the leadership analyses, in the culturally driven kinds of policies. And in the paper, which I did with an initial version, and then the book called The City as an Entertainment Machine, in the sense that entertainment can be a growth machine, but you can have entertainment with or without growth. Entertainment can generate growth, but in Lake Tahoe, maybe not, etc. Okay. How do you reconcile that with the classic economic model? How did we answer that in the first or second session of the class when we said, how many of you would live in Chicago and for a job that paid you only $50,000, or would live in a small town in North Dakota that would pay you $100,000, twice? And most of you, 80% of you, 85% of you said, I'll take the job that pays me half, but I want to be in the big cities. Okay, the economists will analyze and say, you are maximizing your utility. And so utility equals income plus amenities. And so you're saying basically that amenities are worth the amenities I can get in the 3 big cities are worth at least $50,000 to me. And I'll take a $50,000 cut in income. I'll give up half my income to have those amenities. Okay, the point is, Logan and Molich don't put it quite so clearly as that, but they write their new introduction as recognizing the importance of these kinds of factors. And in that way, it's interesting that we see a sort of a convergence away from people who had a sort of simpler material deterministic view 20, 30 years ago to where we are now. Another example is Sharon Zukin, Philip Kasnitz, and Qingmong Chen. They did a book, that's 2016, 1 year ago. We had a session at the American Sociological Association here in Chicago. And the 3 of them write on New York, Amsterdam, and I think it's Shanghai. It's either Shanghai or Beijing. I think it's Shanghai. As they worked on those cities previously, and they had fairly Marxist materialists, I mean, to varying degrees. Sharon was the most explicit, but she also was the most explicit in changing. That is, she did an important book about 20 plus years ago, called Loft Living, on artists living in Lower Manhattan in lofts that they would then convert into studios and living spaces, and that this lifestyle of the arts and aesthetics was transforming the dynamics of a classic Marxist analysis. So she said this in open terms. She still says on her Wikipedia site, Marxist sociology, whatever. But in the book. So the next phase, how do they deal with this a little more systematically? That is, she's been writing about this for some time. So what they do in this book called Global Cities, Local Streets, Everyday Diversity from New York to Shanghai. They look at an individual, not just one street, but a small number of streets in New York, Amsterdam, and Shanghai. And they say, we find here high-end clothing stores for women, boutiques for shoes, we find perfume, we find coffee shops, we find bookstores, we find a young, professional, global style in these 3 cities. And this is a globally shared style, and it looks the same. That's that's almost the end of their theory. So I read through the book and I said, where's the theory of this? I mean, why are they saying this happening? And basically, they're not saying it's Marxism. They're not saying it's not Marxism. They simply have no explicit statement. But basically, the background for this, because this is the same basic argument that you find, for instance, in Saskia Sassen's book, Global Cities, is, the theoretical driver here is basically a Marxist perspective that the economic arrangements drive global capital in the same directions everywhere. And there are lots of people who are saying this very explicitly, which is why I'm addressing it. These are some of the leading people who are doing so in print, but there are a lot of other people who say the same, who write for the Wall Street Journal, who write for New Left Review, and so forth. So the point is, you can be a Marxist in background. You can say, I am a Marxist now, but for instance, Adorno and Horkheimer, Henri Lefebvre in France, Bruno Latour had some of that background, but they recognized loft living. They recognized the importance of artists as drivers. They recognized aesthetics is transforming how cities work. And so the question is how to label it. And Logan, that is, the point I'm making is neither Logan and Malich nor Zukin at all, as some of the major theorists and interpreters of this, try to say what has changed, what is new, how can do we need a new paradigm or not? They basically don't talk about it. So by contrast, I've gotten them upset because I'm saying we should talk about this. The old paradigm doesn't work, and let's try to build a new paradigm incorporating some of the past issues, and we don't get much dialogue. Okay, I'll stop there, and in terms of that, we can come back to it if you want. Younger people who weren't so involved in some of these debates in the past include people like Gordon Douglas. He's got a terrific paper and then a book with the same title on do-it-yourself urban design. These are things like people live next to a building where there's a leaky pipe and there's water going across the sidewalk. And so what do? What would you do if you were living there?
Water.
There's water which is dripping day and night, every day. And so you can't really walk through it. You get water all over yourself.
I mean, walk with my feet and move away.
So you'd walk around it. Is that what you're saying? Okay, and that's one solution. Walk, and yes, certainly many people would walk around it. Yeah?
Yeah, and another solution may be to move away from that area.
Okay, so you may move, you may change your place of residence altogether. What else might people do?
Call 311.
Call 311, okay. Yes, and yeah?
Contact like your local leaders to say that they need to make a change in like sewage, or, like the pipes and stuff.
Indeed. And these are good classic answers, and people have done all of those. But many of the people he writes about have tried these, and then they say, why don't we do something ourselves? Let's put down some boards, let's make a little baby bridge with our own money, our own hands, and just put the little baby bridge, not really a big bridge, just a little sort of cover over it. So they put it down. That is, because they've called or they feel that if I call and wait for the city government to do this, maybe it'll take 3 months or 6 months. This is not a big crisis. It's not a huge problem, but it's a small enough bother that it's troublesome for the people in the area. And so that this general approach he calls, and he's got a whole book filled with thousands of people doing this, do-it-yourself urban design. And this is happening not just in cities. I've been reading, in the last week, I've read 150 applications, papers for our International Sociological Association meetings in Toronto next year. This is happening in rural Nigeria, in rural India, in China. That is, farmers, traditional farmers are coming up with new ways of doing things. They're having agro-tourism. They're creating new kinds of ways of growing mushrooms locally. They're drying out the fish which they catch, and they're salting the fish so it will last longer. Nothing dramatically new, but the point is, people are finding new ways of doing things in all parts of the world. And the part of this is because government doesn't act fast enough or in a manner which is targeted enough to help you with your immediate problems. I'm keeping my distance way up here, as I said, since I'm not Skyping in. Okay, so these I would say are the big points. Oh, well, sorry, one more I left out. Edward Getz. Getz develops and these, as you can see, each of these are really embedded in part in an ideological perspective. Ed Getz is most explicit. He was and is a classic strong leftist. He worked in the environmental department of San Francisco and was active in trying to develop more citizen-responsive environmental policies, and basically saw these as of two types, sort of the classic urban development helping growth, or stopping or challenging growth through policies which might engage citizens more, generally, one, but two, specifically assist low-income citizens disproportionately. So in Peterson's typology, he's saying let's add redistribution to development. Let's combine, if we will permit, if we'll give zoning permits for growth, we will force the developers to pay through constructing low-income housing or low-income facilities or courses, amenities, training programs, and the like. This has been called linked development in places like Chicago, San Francisco, and other U.S. cities which have experimented with this. And he calls these type 2 policies and mandated benefits in economic development. Mandated benefits means that the city government mandates that the developer must provide benefits to low-income persons in order to construct their housing. Okay, these were more popular, let's say, in the era, say, in the 1980s, something of that sort. They have variously come up and down depending on the context. I mean, in the last 6 months, I've heard a fair amount of discussion of these in Chicago. That is, there's several aldermen who've introduced basically this kind of proposal into the Chicago City Council in the last few months, that if we're going to have housing, new housing, we should have more explicit low-income targeted kinds of either housing spaces reserved for them or other kinds of ways of helping low-income persons in the area, because we may be driving out low-income persons from Chicago, is the argument which they have made. Let me just say one or two words here in terms of gentrification as an issue. We've talked about it once or twice very briefly. There's a literature on the topic. how you define gentrification is more than half of the answer of how you analyze and interpret it. The simple definition of gentrification is that young professionals, white, more affluent, show up and they buy or they rent at higher prices, and they drive out the lower income minority persons who were there previously. Okay, that's the simple model, and then the critics will say, and you can tell them because they read the New York Times, they're walking their dogs and they're drinking a Starbucks coffee. Okay, so that's the classic image of the gentrifying force in U.S. cities. And the term to label them is called Yuppies, young urban professionals, YUP. The term was used a little bit, but it was promoted and became nationally important after the Chicago Tribune. Some Chicago Tribune writers said, this is bad for Chicago. And Chicago, more than any other U.S. city, has strong neighborhood identities, a strong sense that these people are coming into our neighborhood and we don't want them. So you had people who forcibly, bartenders, real estate brokers, local lawyers, civic groups in Chicago who would say, no yuppies in my neighborhood was very actively discussed in roughly the maybe 80s and 90s to some degree. You hear elements of this, but in general it's much less salient. As I would say, there's been a move away from the degree of conflict over lifestyle and an acceptance in more diverse ways by all different kinds of people. But these labels and these slogans or these analyses as well remain topics of the literature in sociology, political science, geography, urban policy, and so forth. Another important way that it's changed is a study that was a PhD at Northwestern on a neighborhood in Chicago, in Maine, and I think in Denmark. And the innovation there was to say, are the new residents, not to use the term yuppie, but to look at new residents. And the innovation was many new residents are attracted to a distinctive, diverse area by the diversity. And so Wicker Park is a classic example, and the areas just north of it, uptown, nearby, so forth. That is, people have been attracted, especially young, more cosmopolitan kinds of residents have moved to these neighborhoods because they celebrate either the diversity in terms of ethnicity or in terms of Wicker Park, artists and lifestyle. And in that way, you have people who are not trying to bring in their dog, their Starbucks, and their Wall Street Journal. Rather, you're having people in the book trying to learn how to do Swedish dances because Swedish dances were done for 50 years in the neighborhood, and they want to help continue the Swedish cultural style of the distinctive neighborhood from the past. Okay, that's a reversal, because, and why is this important? Because it explicitly discusses culture, and such as dancing, rather than only saying your face is whiter or darker or you're higher or lower in income. They're trying to say, what do you do? How do you think about the neighborhood? How do you want to change the neighborhood or preserve the neighborhood in its styles? And that is a major innovation, which is changing the ways that many of these things are happening and making it much more subtle. I mean, similarly, you can have people who are, I live in Bronxville, almost everybody's black, but you have great diversity in battles over these kinds of issues. And they're not at all about skin color or income so much as about, well, they can be about income, but they're much more about do we want to serve liquor or to permit liquor to be sold or not? Are they about, do we want people coming in from McCormick Place or not? Do we want to have, how active might the churches be in working with the aldermen? And then these come together. I'm working with the aldermen on a committee now on the renovation of the whole area where Michael Reese was. And the hot issue now is, do we want Amazon to build a second headquarters in the middle of Bronzeville, if they might choose? We don't know if they're going to say yes, we like it, but this has been a salient issue, which has crystallized some of these kinds of discussions. Okay, and just a quick bottom line, the committee basically is saying we're interested in Amazon on condition that they are interested in the culture and heritage of Bronzeville. But the interesting point is that from what we have heard, the Amazon people are saying that is a major plus, which could attract us to a place like Bronzeville, precisely because we want to have diversity and cosmopolitan orientations. Okay, so that's an overview of the key ideas. The next section is on arts and culture in this context. But let me stop for a second here if you have any questions on what I've said. How about someone giving us a non-US example of how much these are similar or different, looking around the room, if any other countries we may have represented. Our French guy is not here today. Anybody else? Oh, there you are, yeah. How does this sound in terms of France or Korea? There's one of you has a sense. That is, in Seoul, Korea, these issues were possibly hotter than in the U.S. That is, some people in Seoul are saying we have too many artists who are transforming our traditional Seoul neighborhoods. Okay, anybody thought about any of that, and or any French examples like that you want to invoke? Probably the most visible dramatic example in France is that the Latin Quarter was called the Left Bank, was the university area ever since the university. Paris was one of the first universities in the world. There were one or two others in Italy and southern France, but basically for 500 plus years, it was the university area, and it was the residential area for many students, and then it became also the residential area for bohemian artists in the early 20th century. Okay, roughly 20 years ago, the big designers, big, 6, 7, 8 big French designers started to move their headquarters into the Latin Quarter. The idea of bourgeois bohemian, having the bohemian style of the Latin Quarter combined with clothes that had a certain bohemian elegance, was an image that the big designers decided they liked, and several moved into the neighborhood, including some American designers. So today, right on the corner of the Place de la Sorbonne, right in front of the main university building, there used to be the #1 bookstore in the whole Latin Quarter, the biggest, the best, and it now says, if you look at it on the front, GAP. They sell American jeans. Okay, in the middle of what was, okay, so that in a sense is exactly the kind of gentrification that people are upset about. And my point is, it's not unique to Chicago or whatever. Okay, so that's point one. Yeah.
Oh, I apologize. I can ask my question like after you're done.
Okay, no, let me just make one more point and then let's go ahead. Okay, so that's point one, that this is happening globally in varying degrees. Point two, how widespread, how important is this? There's been one serious book on this by a guy at NYU, whose name I'm blocking on right now. It's about 2 years old. and he's basically asked, how much gentrification is there? It's basically U.S. How much gentrification is there in the U.S.? And his answer is very, very little. And it's almost all in 2 or 3 of the biggest cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. That once you move beyond a handful of the most affluent areas, most affluent cities, the poor areas are still poor. And some places that were more affluent are getting less affluent. Others are, I mean, gentrification is the opposite. Poor areas that are getting more affluent. So we have all of these processes happening, but the general point is the number, and it may be 1%, 1 or 2%, are that is which we hear about all the time if we read the New York Times, which is written about Manhattan, one of the 5 boroughs only, and Manhattan clearly is a very, very strong, visible example of the gentrification process of pricing out many people who can't afford to live in Manhattan. But the point is, and then it's been called, there's a book and a paper called Superstar Cities. So in a sense, those cities that are growing in overall rent and land value much faster than the average include most of the bigger cities in the U.S. But that's if you take the whole city. If you go down neighborhood by neighborhood and ask what's happening in each of the neighborhoods, there's still in New York, or that is New York once you get beyond Manhattan, but it's certainly in Chicago, L.A., and most other, and if you take the whole U.S., as this guy does, he takes all cities, not just the biggest ones. His basic bottom line is most people who were living in poor neighborhoods 20 years ago are still living in poor neighborhoods. Or let me rephrase that. I said people, that was wrong. Most neighborhoods that were poor 20 years ago are still poor neighborhoods. That does not say there's a zero mobility rate. The question of how much economic or social or educational mobility is there is a different question, and that's been argued about for some time as well. But basically, the numbers, and just in one sentence, basically the story's about the same in the U.S. and this was the news when there was a book by Lipset and Bendix. The Europeans have about the same mobility rates as the U.S. That is, people used to think that the Horatio Alger story, the myth of the poor guy who went up by working hard, was an American myth and an American reality. Truth is, many other places in the world have faster mobility than the U.S., but the myth is still there, and Americans believe this, and including low-income African Americans more often will say, we do not want the government to subsidize poor people, as much as rich Italians say that. Rich Italians in general say, yeah, the government's bad and corrupt, they ought to help the poor people more. Low-income blacks in general want less subsidies of that sort than do the Italians. Okay, so in that sense, that comes from the idea of having a level, so Obama would talk in these terms. We want a level playing field, but we don't want a European-style welfare state which says everybody should have the same income. And so this is debated actively in presidential campaigns and everywhere else. But I mean, but the simple background point is there are 2 different conceptions: equality of opportunity, which says that we should have a level playing field where everybody should have a chance to get the basketball in the basket, or equality, that everybody should have the same number of basketball hits, and if we don't, then we don't want the good athletes to work too hard. Okay, so I'm restating Michael Jordan's answer to the question. You know, how have you been so successful as a basketball player? And his classic answer was, if I believe, I can achieve. Okay, that's Horatio Alger. But the point is, from many 19th century Americans who came here to Michael Jordan today, articulate these concerns. Okay. Sorry, question.
Yeah, so I guess since you asked about experiences in international places, yeah, I spent some time in Athens like last academic year, and I was wondering if you have any specific insight about whether like the issues surrounding gentrification have any correlation with city development there, because from my perspective, there's both a broad historical shift in how the city developed, and then looking through just skimming through some articles about it, there appears to be a shift in the artist sector, like within Athens. The first being that previously Greece had been, prior to the 18th century and including the early, prior to the 19th century, including the first part of that, Greece had been occupied by the Ottoman Empire. And once, in a nutshell, once Greeks declared independence, they started stripping Athens of its Ottoman remnants and reverting it to classical elements. That's something that's completely, you would argue, is completely different from the gentrification like trends that you've discussed, or is that something that like bears some correlation?
Okay, thanks for raising that. I don't know much about the specifics of that. I mean, I'd say the key question is, in terms of trying to answer your question, is who's doing the stripping? That is the idea of gentrification is that much of it is private. That is, it's individual citizens buying or selling houses. It may be real estate brokers. It may be banks making loans. But it's not basically the city government as an explicit policy.
Okay.
Whereas what you're talking about sounds as if it's probably the government, but I don't know.
Actually, that's interesting. It's, from my memory, it was actually mainly Europeans who had, from further north in Europe and places like England and Germany, who came in and tried to instigate this process. So in a way, it's the exact opposite.
Good topic.
Okay.
I can't say enough. I don't know enough to say anything thoughtful, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, I'd say, is it related to? I mean, the way you describe it, insofar as this is Brits and English coming in, for sure. I mean, you could see that as analogous to gentrification, and certainly. I mean, what I do know are people in the early 19th century. There were many Germans and English who were very interested in the classic marble statues and the like, and the paintings, and then they shipped some. They bought it, openly, legally, and they simply sent these back to London and Berlin. Okay, so then 150 years later, now the Greeks are saying, please give us back these marble statues because we'd like to have them here. So, that was not a general urban policy of Athens. That this was a small number of activist archaeologists and others. That is, and so I don't know about how this worked, how this was related to neighborhoods in all of Athens. But that's the point you're making, that it was.
Well, I don't know. I guess what I'm generally asking is trying to determine if there's any correlation between like the topics that have been discussed in class versus what the city how that might have affected city development.
In Athens, this development or something more generally?
Well, just what I'm trying to explain is trying to revert the way Athens looked at the at the end of its Ottoman occupation, for lack of a better word I can think of now, to its classical, something that looked like its classical past, as well as reverting some of it now to archaeological sites. It's my understanding that they're not even buying buildings and demoling, like the government is, or specific archaeological schools are buying buildings and then tearing them down so that they can be the sites of archaeological digs.
Okay, I mean, another thing we can join explicitly with this section, let me continue a little further, is that the archaeology, the paintings, and especially the statues, and then digging as you're discussing now, why are these important as a new way of thinking about cities? Because these are physical manifestations of culture, in the sense that paintings and sculpture are seen as culture in the narrow sense of the arts and culture and theater and music, in contrast to the general idea of rules of the game, or more generally simply economic drivers at city. I mean, even if you say people want to maximize their utility, the question is, what's their utility? And if part of their aesthetic utility is having Greek statues in my museum or in my neighborhood, clearly that's a change which we're seeing around the world today, but not just today. This clearly, with Schliemann and so forth, starting in the early 19th century, this is not all that new. But it was a small elite at that point. Now it's much more general. So which country is doing this most actively in terms of buying more art than any other country in the world right now? China. The Chinese are setting the prices of art in the entire world. London, Paris, New York, so forth. The Chinese are the Chinese are not only economically active, they're completely transforming the art market in a way that the English and Germans were in 1830. Okay. Let's then talk a little bit here about arts and culture. There are three things in this section with stars for important readings. The first one is Yasmin Arakan. Let's put this up. She's a Turkish woman here. Very talented, and did two things. She did an MA here, and she summarized this, and I think the easiest way is just to look at her video. She talks at the beginning, she makes it sound very easy and fun, and at the beginning, she did a review of the literature, which was all studies that compared different locations in the U.S. or anywhere in the world, but these were mostly the U.S., that compared how there may have been an impact or possible impact of the arts on economic or population development, one, and two, what were the drivers of a rise in arts activity, such as the Wicker Park case study we saw of Richard Lloyd. Okay, she summarized them and then basically found that the one thing which they did not do was to look at poor people. Okay, so she was working on this simultaneous with 4 people we were working with who were doing other MAs with us on, and I've mentioned his name before, I'll just put it up here again if you haven't. How many of you have taken a look at I suggested this before. How many of you have seen a YouTube by Theaster Gates? Take a look. He's fabulous. I mean, he's an amazing local resource here at the university. He was an unknown artist on the West Side, low-income guy. His father was a roofer, and he was unknown 15 years ago. He's now been crowned the #1 most important artist in the world at the Venice Biennale about 2 years ago. And he's doing stuff in the low-income areas just south and west of the university. Art Bank is one of his most visible ones, but he does it with irony, with humor, with teasing. People ask and say, "But you know, the bank is taking away my home. What can I do?" And he then opens up my father. So he'll, so he'll sing an answer, or begin, or not necessarily an answer, but at least a reframing of the issue to show you're not alone. A lot of us have got fathers who lost their homes, so forth. He talks about, I'm trying to get to the Ark, which is waiting in Lake Michigan, but I don't know if I can get there because there may be too many bullets on the way. It's a combination of biblical imagery, humor, irony, street smartness, painting, all together. He's charisma exemplified. Okay, so we had four people doing MAs and to try to figure out the. So he and his staff had asked me to work with them about maybe three or so years ago, and they said, we got some money from a foundation. They want us to give a report. What do we do with the money? What are we supposed to say? So they said, and they're showing us stuff like, numbers or population growth. I said, why don't you say, we're too small for these to be meaningful. We know we haven't changed the South Side, but we're doing very creative new things. Why don't you just tell that to the foundation of what are you doing that's new? And they said, well, I don't know if we can do that. I said, well, give it a try. So they called up the foundation. The foundation said, sure, why don't you do that? Okay, so we work with them with the MA students, and basically they put out what is called 9 Principles of Equitable Redevelopment. And this is now on a YouTube as well with that title. Take a look, and you can see how it has a certain relationship to the 15 dimensions of scenes. But it's all done in terms of Theaster's style he put on a one-day conference, or it's a half-a-day conference embedded in our scenes conference, where he had 9 muses, poets, poetesses, and others, or let's say lawyers acting like poetesses, telling stories about equality, lesbian freedom, etc. I mean, all kinds of great stuff done with a DJ, with masterful style. Okay. Example 1. So that was one MA, the 9 Principles of Equitable Development. Second MA was on what's he do. So this woman, participant observation, just followed around some of the people in the programs that they did every day for part of a year. Yoga, for instance. They'd have a yoga class with only 8 people. Before they did yoga, they'd each take 10 minutes and talk about the biggest problem they were facing in their lives. These are mainly low-income African-American women, and they don't have psychiatrists, they don't have health care, at the USC hospital. I mean, you can walk over and talk about all your problems for hours and hours, and at a low. I mean, his folks could not, and so you can have a yoga class where you can do this. Okay, so it transformed the yoga experience into something that was much more neighborhood-specific, low-income African-American in style. And his staff, he has a staff as of, I don't know, it changes every week, but a year or two ago, it's about 45 people. And they all are very sensitive to these kinds of issues in art programs, in a black music festival, in book shows, in DJ training, in high school and grammar school presentations they do to try to reach kids in neighborhood schools in the area. These kinds of things are there, but adapted in various ways. Okay, so those were 2, 3. There was an effort to look at this in other cities, but the most systematic was the most, let's say, nationally systematic was Yasmin Arakan. Okay, her point was, if we look at the others, that is the policy question, which was asked again and again by the dean of the Harris School, by the City of Chicago Commissioner on Arts and Culture, and by the key funder that was there. These 3 people were all there with Theaster when they opened the art bank, and they all said, Theaster, how and when can you leverage this up? We don't, you know, it's great to do this in 2 little neighborhoods with 5 houses, but how can you transform Chicago, New York, LA, the rest of the world, basically? And he said, well, we're working on it. That is, he didn't answer, he didn't try to answer. Okay, she, in a sense, looked at a way of how to answer that. And so what she did was to take how many artists are there in every neighborhood, in every zip code in the whole US? 45,000. And actually, we only had data on those for 35,000, roughly. So 35,000 is still a lot in the whole US. How many artists, and then how much of the artists increased? So we have level and change of artists. Then we have level and change of income, jobs, education, and so forth. Okay, so she sets up a model which is basically how much do artists add to this? Do artists add value here or not? Either as a direct effect or through these other kinds of things. Question mark. Okay, so much of the discussion implies yes, artists should make a difference, but what she added was the way we often show this. She did this 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. High income, middle income, lower middle income, low income. So if you're in a low income neighborhood, how much does this change if we have the same kind of model repeated 4 different times in the different income levels? And nobody had done this before. And the interesting result was in all 4 cases, the arts had a clear, distinctive impact on increasing income, education, rent, one or two other urban development kinds of things. However, they were not as strong in 3 and 4 as they were in 1 or 2, and the specific combination shifted. That is, they weren't the same everywhere. Then she did it another, after she presented this once, she repeated it, including a African American and Hispanic combined with low income, and that basically did not change the results significantly. Yeah.
So is this like considering like public access to the arts, or was it like number like
just number of people who live in a neighborhood who say I'm an artist when the census says what's your job? So it hugely undercounts artists because most people say I'm a taxi driver or I'm a waitress or you know I'm an Uber driver because that's where I make my money. But what I really love is painting. But that's true all around the world. So we have that is for the censuses. I won't say all censuses. The U.S. census is particularly opaque in ignoring artists. Some other censuses, I think the British and German, are now asking more sensitive questions about do you sometimes do art, and there's special censuses. So there's special studies that are not part of the regular census, which are trying to capture the numbers of artists more sensitively. But this is just a crude, basic measure.
I wonder like how this maps onto like the Rebuild Foundation example, because it seems like the work is very much like directed at like African American communities on like the south and southwest side, but like also like if you're talking about in terms of like neighborhood and like kind of like hyper localism, like I don't know, like just kind of like anecdotally. I've done like a pretty in-depth project on Woodlawn and then a separate project on the Arts Bank. But in all of my
these are 2 of Theaster Gates'.
Yeah, and
projects.
so Woodlawn, so the Arts Bank is kind of on the western or the eastern border of Woodlawn. It's like technically in South Shore, but it's like for all intents and purposes like really in Woodlawn. But I asked all of my respondents in the Woodlawn project, and I also had worked there for a while. If they were familiar with the Arts Bank, and the only person who was not a resident of Woodlawn. She was like a college graduate who is herself an artist and like really looks up to Theaster Gates, but none of the neighborhood residents had even heard of it. And when I asked like, what do you consider to be community space, first it was like a couple of restaurants and churches, which I think is really interesting because and like in like visiting the arts bank, like it's definitely a predominantly African American artist, but like just the way people dress, I would not guess they're from the neighborhood. Like there seems to be kind of a wealth in like the primary people who attend it, which I think like is interesting in measuring if it's kind of a local institution.
Yeah, it depends on the event. I mean,
Yeah.
there are some, if it's an
definitely.
artist-oriented event, then they'll draw artists from all over the city.
Mhm.
But if it's yoga, it's more likely to be local.
Yeah, and the different I think like examining the different locations too, because the yoga's at Dorchester, I think it used to be at the Arts Bank, but now they've like separated out more. But I think in terms of like positioning something, is it really like a local institution, or is it more broadly kind of like an institution of like the like abstracted culture of the South Side? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure. And and I mean, he would give a more eloquent answer, but I would say both. That is, he's become a major international artist. I mean, he's winning these international prizes in England and Germany and at the international meetings and so forth. On the other hand, his legitimacy and his roots are very deep and very local, and they're low-income African American. When he does and he's gotten money, he's got lots of people are offering him money. He's working in Gary, Detroit. He's working in low-income African American neighborhoods, and he's trying to reach them as well. So he's open, for instance, or he sort of masterminded, but he does things creatively. That's what's wonderful. So he with the idea, he worked with the people in Gary. What can you do in Gary that would sort of make a statement, would make things different? It wasn't art per se, it was a restaurant. So they got an old warehouse, and they brought in, they renovated it. I mean, and what he also brings is things that make it look really nice. So the old building is redone, so it looks beautiful, a lot like the art bank in that sense. But he didn't try to mastermind what they're going to do. They have a series of different local chefs that's from Gary who serve their food in this same place, but different nights, different days of the week, but in a beautiful setting. And it seems to have been, or it's too early to say for sure, but it's a very creative idea. It's not saying we'll give the money to one chef or one building or one person. It's saying, here's a new setting, a new forum. Because it's being done so nicely, it'll get some visible attention, but we want to feature local participants, African American, lower status as waiters and chefs and so forth, and the most of the clientele is the same, and so in that sense, it's he's trying to be authentic in those explicit terms. Any other thoughts on either Theaster or these related issues? Because these issues are being increasingly discussed around the world, as we have, say, within China, within the U.S. especially, in some measures, increasing gaps between persons in terms of income, and so, and this is obviously on television 5 nights a week, with Trump in the White House, with the tax reform being discussed. That this is front and center stuff, and the well, okay. I won't go that route unless you have a question and want to pursue it further. Let me mention some of the high points in the art section here. So this is Yasmin Arakan, and I've given you her quick result. You can see a little more on the presentation. The second is the material which are in the earlier sections, which we've already covered to some degree. Kentuckville Karaoke, subtitle, How the Arts and Culture Can Transform Politics and the Economy. And this, as you recall, reviewed the 2 main theories from the West, from Tocqueville for politics and from Jane Jacobs and others for Balzac, Baudelaire, and so forth, for the artists and the economy, that innovation drives the economy. And these fell flat in Asia. That was our first finding. Hey, the Asians they never heard of this, they're not doing it, it doesn't seem to be, so what's different about Asia? And so we worked for 7 years with these 10 or 15 smart Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and others who were involved in these issues. And I've discussed some of the results already, but we can discuss it further if you want. The Glazer et al. Paper in Consumer City, the Richard Florida Rise of the Creative Class, the Silver and Clark Scenescapes, all of these raise points about smart cities that compete less for jobs and more for talented residents, with amenities like bike paths and so forth. The other reference, important reference I'll mention, you had here a couple of weeks ago was let's put her name up again. Hee-Sun Chung. I mean, her PhD is very, very smartly done, and it takes the Jane Jacobs ideas about the arts as drivers of development, joined with the bohemian idea from the French background, and showed that this explains public transit use, bicycle use, and she's now analyzing divvy bicycle rentals by neighborhood and finding that yes, you need to include income, education, race, and so forth, gender, but after you do so, the arts changes everything else. And having either the arts and or a bohemian measure, and she's using each of these in different contexts, in Chicago, in Paris, and in Seoul, the three cities that she used in her PhD, and which she talked to you about, again are showing in multi-methods. So she has photographs, she has videos. I took some videos and photographs that she used as well, and learned in the process of, so we looked at the menus, what are the menus around Boys Town and then around the Cubs Stadium. And these are part of the same zip code, but they're drastically different subcultures. And it's clear in the menus. You can have either a hamburger and a beer, or you can have, Thai combined, distilled with vinegar, with et cetera, in the more bohemian neighborhood. Okay, so bohemianism has economic and policy impacts, is what she's shown pretty clearly here. Okay, let me stop there. We've got 20 minutes. That's fine. Okay, we could.
7 minutes.
Sorry.
We have 7 minutes.
7. So I'm looking at the wrong clock here. Okay, no, you're right. Thank you. 7 minutes. Fair enough. 7 minutes for discussion.
I may want to add a point about the gentrification and the local traditions of the example of China. But as I've observed in China, that process may be more complicated because the government actually they have some power for the reconstruction of some local places. So maybe in the earlier years, actually there are maybe both general and local gentrification within the fast developing cities. And in the more recent years, when the government became more gentle and more and smarter in the urban constructions, actually they no longer to force the original local people to leave their original places. They no longer to protect buildings and they no longer do that. So today the situation becomes that because the land price is increasing, and actually the owners of the traditional buildings or the very old buildings, the owners are actually rich, but the people living in that area is still poor. So yeah, that may be more complicated than the situation you mentioned.
Well, I mean, what I sketched was very simple and short. The details are much longer and more complicated, as they are in China. So there's a there's a PhD. We had a research assistant and teaching assistant here is Jean Lin. She's Taiwanese, but her PhD is on mainland China, and she studied really 3 towns in mainland China. They're all in the area. They're really, I think they're all suburbs of Beijing. But what was interesting was 3 cities, 3 small towns, 3 drastically different policies. So the big message which it sends is don't generalize about all of China. You can have within 3 towns nearby each other 3 very different policies on these kinds of issues. And for example, in one instance, there were sort of local activist pressure groups that were saying, we don't want what the national government wants. We're protesting. We don't want more development and so forth. And the national government said tough, and they just they bulldozed. I mean, they ignored the local people. They ignored the local mayor, and they went right ahead. In another one, where they had people who had the same policies, but they did it in a subtle way. They didn't just argue and protest. They worked. They had more people who were higher level involved with ministries. They worked through the ministries. They were low-keyed and said, could we negotiate a solution? And basically the national government said yes. So the third was a different type. But my point is, these same kinds of things work in China and in the U.S. and in Yugoslavia and in Greece. Question is where and why and how specifically. So smart leaders can negotiate things in ways that are very different, even if you have roughly similar, often some of the similar population characteristics. I mean, that's what Jean Lin showed in a very interesting way. But in similar manner, that there is not one China story, just as there's not one American story. Okay. Other questions or comments? Her PhD is available in sociology here about 3 or 4 years ago.
She's also just a really nice person, so you should talk to her.
Yes. She's in San Francisco now, isn't she?
Yeah.
Okay. You're all invited to participate. Anybody else before we let our Greek question come back? Or do you have a non-Greek question?
Well, it was about something different.
Go ahead.
This is actually relevant to certain parts of Athens related on a more micro scale, but I think this might help me get this clearer, but if a certain locality or a set of neighborhoods are getting gentrified in the sense that more bars and restaurants are coming in, rather than actually taking artists out or displacing artist communities, is that something that works against the trend that this class is basically been devoted to?
Well, bars and restaurants per se are not either high, middle, or low income. You can have them of all income and cultural styles. And I mentioned briefly that in France, they have strong zoning and they're very, very careful about where these go. In the US, we have medium zoning, and you tend to separate the bars and restaurants and the retail from residential, but not as tightly as in France, say. in much of Asia, traditionally, there's weak or no zoning, or that is compared to France, there's almost there's nothing like that. So you have much more heterogeneity within neighborhoods in Korea and in China and Japan than you do in Chicago or in Western Europe. But I wouldn't say that that implies that none of these imply with the, I mean, I'm using the Asian case because it's so large, it's so important, and it does not imply that bars or restaurants are high, middle, or low income. That is, you can have all combinations, basically. So gentrification in that sense is often oversold as a process, especially if it's being done just, you know, by one, and it's usually, in many instances, being just done by a few entrepreneurs or shoppers, not by the national government. So we heard the example implicitly. For instance, just to be more explicit, when the Beijing Olympics was held, maybe 10 years or so ago, this was big, big stuff. I mean, the whole city of Beijing was deeply transformed. They tore down. So you heard today, the government, the national government has become, gentle was your term? Okay. For the Beijing Olympics, I think there were 30,000 or 50,000 people were told, you know, your housing will be gone in 3 months, something like that. That is, they're basically all kicked out. And then what bothered some of the locals more was they had international competitions among architects for building beautiful buildings. And the people who won were Germans and Italians and English and so forth, not Chinese. Second, there is no Chinese motif in most of those buildings. They're all international global architecture. So they're huge, vast, dramatic statements from an architectural standpoint. But the Chinese architects were furious because there's nothing Chinese about it and no linkage to traditional China. And they protested to the mayor, they protested to the city council. There's a PhD on this at Princeton by a woman who was working with me at the time. And basically said this is not authentically Chinese, and the mayor and the others said, too bad, we want dramatic international architecture. And so that's the context, I think, against which you're getting the current situation that you just heard described. They're not moving people out quite so dramatically as was done then.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yes. One last question. Yeah.
Okay, are you implying that the gentrification is coming with the internationalization?
No. I mean, it was discussed that way in Beijing, but certainly not necessarily. I mean, it may be. I mean, in some cities for some people some of the time, but that is. Let me end on a different note. Boulder, Colorado, is openly anti-global, anti-national. So if you want to open a big box store, like a Best Buy shop in Boulder, Colorado, and you apply to the city council for a zoning permit, they will say, no, we refuse to have any big box stores in Boulder. They want local firms and local style. Okay, so the point is, these are not just things that are imagined by social scientists. If you look in places like Boulder, you can see visibly anti-global, anti-national, pro-local policies in place. So you can then, in a sense, this is the opposite of, well, it's the opposite of what you get in other places. But we don't have to invent these. We can look and find these policies around us and learn from them in the process. Okay. Thank you. We'll quit there.
Just email with me. And so we're going to figure this out.
I just wanted to say,
No, not at all.
I think it helped me better understand.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Now that's how we all work and improve.
Yeah.